Iran is a market at the point of reopening. It's exciting interest in many companies in many countries. I went with a delegation, a BICC delegation to Iran in October, and 19 companies came with us. But in the same hotel, there was a delegation, a business delegation from Lower Saxony, where there were 75 companies. So you can either think of the British in Iran as being very special or a bit behind the Germans. Iran hasn't been entirely closed for trade, but it has been in purdah for about 10 years. This is due to increasingly restrictive sanctions. EU countries have lost trade and Asian countries have gained trade. The UK has lost more than any other country in the EU, exports falling 82% to about 100 million in 2014. That's 100 million of euros, and it's direct exports. A lot of British trade goes via other centres like Dubai. The market is reopening because in 2015 an agreement was reached between the EU 3+3. That is UK, France, Germany, plus the US, China and Russia. And they come to an agreement with Iran. And under this agreement, sanctions will be lifted in return for Iran agreeing to curtail its nuclear industry. Now is an ideal time to focus on Iran, I believe, because we're approaching a trigger point in the lifting of sanctions. Iran has a diversified economy. It has a stable business environment. It has a private sector, and further privatization is intended. And it has a pent-up demand for European goods and services. It's an energy superpower. It has the second largest gas reserves in the world and the fourth largest oil reserves. It is thought by many to be the great emerging market at the moment. Iran's politics are based on democratic principles and pluralism. Iran is politically stable, and power is divided between unelected and elected bodies. And the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, who was unelected by the general franchise, holds the balance of power between competing factions. His policy is to stop the loyal factions from pushing other factions from a share of the power. Khamenei has the final say, but President Rouhani is trusted by him to run the government. And presidential elections are due in 2017. Rouhani's popularity gives him a very good chance of re-election. The key interest groups in Iran are the clerical establishments, the security agencies, the Iran Revolutionary Guards Corps, and big business, known as the Bazaar, along with quangos, known as the bonyads, for all of whom have not really suffered under sanctions, but rather they've prospered. It is important for exporters to understand who their buyers are in Iran. That you need to understand who the ultimate shareholders or controllers of a company are. Due diligence on this is most important, as not all buyers in Iran will be delisted after implementation day. I'll come to that in a minute. The security machinery in Iran monitors political ideas and expression, and it's become more intrusive over recent years, and so far Rouhani hasn't been able to roll it back very much. The economic situation doesn't threaten the survival of the regime in the short or the medium term. Population is generally squeezed because of sanctions largely, but is unlikely to risk an uprising. In Iran, evolution is preferred over revolution. Iran's foreign policy, which is most important in the Middle East at the moment, is one of constructive engagement and the recognition of the legitimate interests of other countries in the Middle East. Looking at the economy, the background is that in the 8 years to 2013, there was very poor management. The former president, Ahmadinejad, was in control of the economy then. There was endemic inflation, sometimes hyperinflation, which increased with subsidy reform, a housing bubble, huge growth in bank lending, leading to very bad debts which crippled the banking sector. Also, the government had a budget deficit. All this is being in the process of being rectified by the present government. Inflation is down to about 15%. There's a new 5-year plan, the 6th plan. It's probably based on an over-optimistic oil price of $60, but there we are. And assuming sanctions are lifted in Q1 of 2016, the World Bank expects GDP to rise by 5.8% in 2016 and 6.7% in 2017. This is based on the growth of oil production during that period. It's a country of 78 million people, 60% of whom are under 30 years old, and 93% of whom are literate, and there are 32 million internet users. In addition to its oil and gas reserves, Iran has 4% of the world's mineral resources. So energy and mineral resources are in abundance. It has an educated workforce, but cheap labour costs by our standards. Iran's location gives it markets of some 300 million people in the Caspian, Persian, Gulf state areas, as well as adjacent countries in Asia. Employment in the economy is roughly 18% in agriculture, 35% in industry, and 18% services, which gives an approximation of where UK export strategy ought to be focused. This is a hopeful setting, I believe, for UK exporters in oil and gas, in petrochemicals, in mining, engineering services, and supply, transport, being rail, high-speed rail, airports, aircraft, and ports. It's also an opportunity in the automobile sector. Iran builds more cars than we do. It's opportunity in medical, hotels, tourism, IT, and particularly in services, city services, most notably. Investment and development intentions up to 2020 are huge. For example, $160 billion is estimated to be invested, will be invested in 197 individual energy projects. $25 billion will be invested in the infrastructure. 400 new aircraft are to be purchased. Most hospitals need upgrading. And the Supreme Leader has indicated that he wished to boost tourism, perhaps to 25 million visitors in 2020. The positives for the economy, I would say, after sanctions are lifted, are the extra oil income that will come from the sale of a further 1 million barrels per day, lower trade and finance costs, and renewed access to foreign markets. Some of Iran's wants are joint venture investment, transfer of technology, to become a regional manufacturer, to extend payment terms for trade contracts. Approaching Iran for the first time, companies should bear these wants in mind. It offers the opportunity of delivering to Iran what they want to see. The reason why the market is reopening is because the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was signed on the 14th of July after 22 months of intensive talks. And the implementation of this is expected sometime in the first quarter of 2016. There will be a large-scale removal of EU sanctions and a lifting of asset freezes on individuals and companies that you might want to deal with in trading. US sanctions will be lifted when this can be done by executive order. The law in the US won't be changed. And you should bear in mind that US sanctions aren't only to do with the nuclear sector, that there are sanctions related to terrorism and human rights. The implementation day for all this could be as early as mid-January. So those wishing to enter or re-enter the market should start thinking about it now, I believe, if you haven't done so already. However, even though sanctions are lifted, there is what I call an informal banking boycott, created by the exemplary effect of US agencies imposing penalties on banks around the world, but particularly UK banks, who have alleged but not been proved to have broken US sanctions law. This means that the UK and other international banks will not easily and quickly provide trade finance, including money transmission. So this will go on for some time beyond implementation date. However, I believe, well, banking does carry on now, it's just more complicated than what you're normally familiar with in trade finance. But I believe that the banking market will gradually come back through foreign and second-tier banks in London, as in the first instance. Anyway, you will need to be ingenious in creating your payment routes. Iran is quite familiar with this. It has helped importers do this in the period of sanctions. Like anywhere else, there are risks of doing business in Iran, but by and large, I judge at the moment that they're not too stressful. So, for example, the political risk in Iran is at about a 5-year low. As I say, revolution is deterred by the culture, and evolution is much more preferred. President Rouhani seems likely to win a second term in 2017. He's a centrist, he's not ideological, and he wants things to happen that work. Transmission from Khamenei as supreme leader is likely to be a managed process. The risks from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action are low, in my opinion. They're higher from the problems in Congress in the US than there are from problems in Iran. Trade and finance with Iran is likely to survive the continuing turmoil in the states to the west of Iran. The economy itself is rather a mixed picture, but positive developments significantly outweigh the negative, I believe. There will continue to be public budget stringency, however. Caution by the mainstream banks of the world towards Iran is epitomized by an Iranian proverb which says, anyone bitten by a snake will be frightened of a black and white rope. And I think there's an element of that in the return of the banks. Excuse me. What can companies do now, even though the sanctions for the moment are still in place? Well, where trade is allowed now, for example, pharmaceuticals and medical equipment, this can continue. Otherwise, companies may not enter into contracts with Iranian entities within the law until after implementation date. Fingers crossed in January. Companies can visit Iran, they can identify agents, they can develop market strategies, they can discuss prospective contracts with potential buyers. This should be done as soon as possible. The rest of the world is doing this now. And there's been an extraordinary scramble from EU countries. This is an opportunity for me also just to mention what is the British-Iranian Chamber of Commerce. We are a networking organisation of politicians and businesses here who believe in the development of trade and investment with Iran as a way of improving relations with Iran. We have a counterpart Chamber of Commerce in Iran, We hold business and social events for networking and help members with contractual or relationship problems in Iran. We have the support of the British Iranian community and their historic and family relationships in Iran. The community in the UK of Iranian origin is some 1/3 of a million people. This is the second largest community of Iranian origin outside the US. So in that sense, the UK is in quite a strong position. Our board is made up of leading British and Iranian controlled companies, experts on trade with Iran, and Lord Lamont is our chairman, formerly Chancellor of the Exchequer. He is the UK's leading politician to have championed engagement with Iran over many years. One last thing I'd like to mention is about networking in Iran. Networking in Iran is important for Iran because of the market's traditional structures. It's very often the way in which information is best verified or clarified. It is the way to meet people. Iran business is much based on personal contact, much more based on personal contact than is the business in many other countries. Help and assistance for importers comes through networking to a much greater extent than other more sophisticated markets. So this is rather a quick dash through why Iran, in my opinion, is one worth looking at and concentrating on. But there's too many questions to be answered about doing business in Iran that I couldn't put it all in this presentation. But I'd be very happy to answer any questions if you have them. Answer them now. So thank you very much.
What is it that specifically has to happen for the economic sanctions to be lifted?
Okay. What specifically has to happen for economic sanctions to be lifted? At the moment, the International Atomic Energy Authority is monitoring what Iran is doing and its nuclear industry. Its intermediate or interim reports so far, including one last night, are that Iran is meeting its obligation under the plan of action. What is more, the possibility of a military dimension to the nuclear industry hasn't been evident since 2009. Now this, it is believed, will be the trigger which will allow the US, the UK, Germany, Russia, China to declare that an implementation of the agreement can happen. We think this process, because of it has to go through the board of the IAEA, has to go to the Security Council, has to go to the countries involved, means that you can expect implementation to be declared about mid-January. It may take a bit longer, but there's a geopolitical reason why it should be sooner rather than later, because there are Margulis elections on the 28th of February. The Margulis, the government parliamentary elections on the 28th of February. And the West wish to evidence that Rouhani has delivered on his promise on the question of sanctions. This is a political pressure on the West to accept, unless there's some awful thing in the IAEA report, that Iran has complied and implementation day can be declared. So this is why I think it's likely to be January. There's this pressure to do it. It's required Obama to stand up to Israel, to stand up to the Congress. It's required Rouhani to stand up to the Margulis. It's required them to be brave, and they have been.
You mentioned about finding out who actually owns the companies, and they might not be off the list. Could you give us a bit more insight on that?
Yes. The question is, how do you find out with a company that you're going to contract with, who controls it, whose shareholders are? Iran doesn't have the equivalent of Companies House, which would be straightforward, or more straightforward. So you need to speak in the market. You shouldn't contract. If somebody rushes up to you, and there'll be many people like this, wanting to do business with you, take a deep breath and investigate them. You can do this in many ways, but one of the ways is you can look on listings of companies that are still under sanction, and there will still be some companies under sanction after implementation date. The sort of companies are the companies controlled by the Revolutionary Guards. They're likely to be under sanction still. So you can look at these lists, like Reuters have a list of companies that will still be sanctioned. Then what you should do through your networks is you should talk to people who know the company. In the old days, before there was lots of documentation and published information, this is what you would do in the market. You would go down to the marketplace and you would talk, you'd find out about people. You have to do this. You have to do this. And this is a most important thing to do. You shouldn't engage in a contract with people that are either individuals or corporates that are still listed. Many, many individuals and corporates will be delisted on implementation day, including the oil company and so on. But you do need to check that. I suppose you're all converts to Iran. Right? Then you have no more questions. I'll be happy to answer any more, though. Okay.